When I came into the church, I was darn sure there was something missing here. You know, there's got to be like an altar call or some act that confirms that I've actually showed up, right? And that I'm actually in. God, help us. Until you find out that that's the trappings of the world putting its ideas onto the church. Those were preachers who wanted to see just how many people were moved in that moment. But being moved in the moment does not equate to a lifetime of faith and walking with the Lord. The only thing that can do that is Christ himself opening the heart, pouring his Spirit into you. That is being born from above, and that transformation begins. There is no person in this book that came in contact with Christ that wasn't changed one way or another. And don't think that everybody that comes in contact is changed for the good. As I said, the same words bring life to some and death to others. Some people were vessels created to honor and others to dishonor. This is scriptural, not my opinion. So it's important to understand something. If we're really looking at trying to understand transformation in coming in contact with Christ, there could be no better person to focus on than the Apostle Paul. And I've done this before, but I'm going to do this in a different way. And I've got good reason. There's reason and logic underneath this all. You see, most people would make the case, as I've preached over the years, that maybe the disciples, those closest that loved Christ, that followed him around during his earthly ministry, they loved him so much that they might even feign some of these transformations. I'm not saying they did, but that's been a hypothesis, that they faked it and they feigned a lot of things. But when you encounter the person of Paul, who was first Saul of Tarsus, that theory goes out the window. And you've got to understand he represents something that if people can kind of wrap their minds around the depth of the transformation, don't just think Damascus Road, because we're going to talk about it, but don't just think that. I'm asking you to rethink how that transformation process over time occurs. And when we can look at it with a slightly different set of eyes, not the one that's read this many, many times and you're so familiar with it, you go, yeah. But looking at it to better understand. Here is a man, we encounter him in the book of Acts. If you're going to open your Bible, you can open it to the 7th chapter. But we encounter Stephen, who was one of, we'll call him a Jewish convert to Christianity, and he's delivering basically his defense of the faith. If you have a Bible like mine, it's Stephen's sermon. That's the way it's labeled in Acts 7. But in reality, it is the defense of his faith. And that whole defense is made up. Remember, there is no New Testament. The New Testament is being written kind of as this book is unfolding. So all that Stephen is going to mention in his defense of the faith is tied into his former beliefs about everything that came in the Old Testament, and that somehow it's all tethered to Christ. Now, in the crowd, there is this one called Saul, who later will become Paul, but Saul, who his whole being is rooted in devout Judaism. He is a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin, a Pharisee, someone who had such zeal for God that he believed in persecuting Christians for their faith simply because they were following Christ. And I want you to think first and foremost that in many ways, Saul of Tarsus reminds us a little bit, for some reason, I don't know why, but of King Saul in those, we'll call them ebbs and flows of nonsensical rage and anger towards David. You're seeing what I would call the same spirit on Saul of Tarsus, possessed with what I'd call an unexplainable rage or anger, and set out to hurt, destroy, persecute people who weren't hurting anybody. They were just following what was then not yet called Christian, but Those that followed Christ were called the way. They were in the way. All right. So we have this, what I'd call brilliant, if you read through in your own leisure, if you read through everything that Stephen says, he is arrested, he's making his defense, and they are just about to stone him. And if you read in Acts 7, and right about at verse 58, it's talking about that they cast Stephen out of the city and stoned him. And the witnesses laid down their clothes at a young man's feet whose name was Saul. That will eventually become the Apostle Paul. They stoned Stephen, calling upon God and saying, Lord Jesus, as they stoned him, he called out, said, Lord Jesus, receive my spirit. So we have this picture. And why I start there is because if you really think about it, if we read the Old Testament and we study the Old Testament, that's all there was at this point, you have to ask, was this so egregious? Well, in the eyes of a zealous Jew, it would be, to declare that somehow Messiah was come, when how could Messiah have been crucified? And then this blasphemy of him somehow being resurrected, right? So if you keep reading, in the 8th chapter, and Saul was consenting unto his death, and at that time there was great persecution against the church, which was at Jerusalem, and they were all scattered abroad throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. And of course, you can kind of read down in the 3rd verse, as for Saul, he made havoc of the church, entering into every house and hauling men and women, committing them to prison. So kind of interesting that you can see it didn't satisfy that one person was stoned because they were proclaiming Christ. It's a mission on his part. And what I love is if you read, you're going to do a little bit of page turning. In chapter 26, verse 9 through 11 of the book of Acts, this is Paul saying, this is what he did. Which thing I also did in Jerusalem, and many of the saints did I shut up in prison, having received authority from the chief priests. When they were put to death, I gave my voice against them, and I punished them oft in every synagogue, and compelled them to blaspheme, and being exceedingly mad against them, I persecuted them even unto strange cities. This is Paul speaking, all right? And if you want to go one step further, you can stay right there. I'll read you something else that he wrote, because if we keep turning, you'll spend more time turning. I'll just read you what he says in Galatians when he says, for you have heard of my conversation, my behavior in time past of the Jews' religion, how that beyond measure I persecuted the church of God, and I wasted it, and profited in the Jews' religion above many my equals in mine own nation, being more exceedingly zealous of the tradition of my fathers. But read the next verse. But when it pleased God, who separated me from my mother's womb and called me by his grace to reveal his son in me. There's the ticket right there. So a beginning point is understanding that Paul himself could not will the change. And in fact, if anybody tries to poke holes in the Christian faith, I'd say if you have any reason to reject the gospel writers, you could say collusion or lies, but here is one who calls himself a man born out of due time. He had no reason to perpetuate this Christ story or even try to figure out, again, if you really understand what would have happened to somebody in that day, to be as bold as to persecute the church and then turn on a dime seemingly and start preaching Christ. And that's what made the whole community say, don't trust this guy. We know where he came from. We know what he did, right? So it really becomes important to understand. There is another, actually, I'll read it to you as well. There's one more passage that is in Acts that kind of describes a little bit of his, we'll call former behavior, where he says, I persecuted this way unto death, binding and delivering them into prisons, both men and women, as also the high priest does bear me witness, and all the estate of the elders, from whom I also received letters unto the brethren, and went to Damascus to bring them which were there bound unto Jerusalem to be punished. So he repeats himself many times. He doesn't deny that he was trying to destroy Christians and the Christian faith. So if we want to talk about how people can look at this and start understanding how transformation occurs, people will argue, and they have argued with me, okay, you're right on this, but God has not been performing Damascus Road experiences like that in our modern day. No one gets knocked down in the middle of the street, sees a light, hears a voice. That doesn't happen that way. That's right. Because now we'll call it a mass multitude of people, a little bit different. And I would say also God needed to do something with Saul, who becomes Paul, in a very distinct way that he himself would have probably, knowing the Old Testament, the only covenant at that time, would have understood some connections that become abundantly clear as you read on. So first thing, we are, if you're still with me in the early chapters of Acts, in the opening of the 9th chapter, it says, Saul, yet breathing out threatenings and slaughter against the disciples of the Lord, went unto the high priest and desired of him letters to Damascus, to the synagogues, that if he found any of this way, Christians, whether they were men or women, that he might bring them bound unto Jerusalem. And as he journeyed, he came near Damascus, and suddenly there shined round about him a light from heaven. He fell to the earth and heard a voice saying, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? And he's saying, Who art thou, Lord? And the Lord said, I am Jesus whom thou persecutest. It's hard for thee to kick against the pricks. And he, trembling and astonished, said, Lord, what wilt thou have me to do? And the Lord said unto him, Arise, go into the city, and it shall be told thee what thou must do. Now, I want you to just pay attention to something, because we gloss over this. The men which journeyed with him stood speechless, hearing a voice, but seeing no man. Saul arose from the earth. When his eyes were open, he saw no man. He was blind. He was blind for 3 days. Now, all of this becomes kind of important. And why do I say that? Because God comes in contact with us in ways that we might be the most familiar with. And that's why some people just casually discount things that happen because it's so familiar. Well, what would be familiar to a man like Saul about this conversion? Well, let me explain to you. Here's a man who was steeped, as I said, in the Old Testament, specifically in the Torah, who knew exactly the experience of Moses having gone up in an encounter with God, where God's Shekinah glory basically covers Moses. He's now glowing with the light or the Shekinah of God, and puts on a veil to basically kind of cover up that, call it glorification. That veil will become emblematic with the people of Israel, who would be blinded to not see the light. But to people who understood the symbolism, that light, the concept of light through the Bible never changed. So there are very distinct ways in which God did what he did for Saul. And people say, well, how come other people don't have a Damascus Road experience like that? Because that was specific to him. And in ways that he could understand and know this was God. Again, it's impossible to convey how God comes to us right where we're at. There's a whole universe of church people out there that say, wash, clean, change, then you can come in. You can see right here, here's a man still breathing out threatenings when he has an encounter with Christ. And God chose this specific method knowing this is a man who would understand what this blinding light would mean, an encounter with God. And this is what I want to tell you. A lot of people think the transformation that occurs in the Christian has to be like this, but I'm telling you something. It will come to you exactly where you're at. He will come to you exactly where you are at. And you may not have some radically cataclysmic event that happens, but if you look back, the importance of looking back is to understand where you were. And you may not know the day or the hour. Some people want to tell you the day, the hour, everything, how the Lord saved them. But rather looking at the bigger picture, I can speak for me, and I can say that certain things, when I look back, I realize that was God working. I did not see them as God then. I couldn't. I was still walking in darkness and being moved into the light, so I couldn't see it. I'm asking everybody in the sound of my voice to understand something. Transformation comes, and if there is no transformation, I'm telling you something that's really important that nobody wants to say. If you have not the Spirit of Christ, you're none of His. There will not be a transformation. Nothing's going to happen to you. In fact, you may either delude yourself into thinking that you're really okay, or you continue with your ways and you're never brought to a conscience that is not seared over. You're never brought to a humbling point where we used to use the word here, the three-legged hobble treatment, right? Where you're crippled for a time for God to teach you. You're not as big and as great and as important as you once thought you were. And then perspective kicks in. And the eyes begin to see the world around you in a different way. This is no different than what happens to Saul, who becomes Paul. Now, his character, let's talk about this. He was completely convinced as a zealous Jew that he was doing the work of God, which tells you that even people walking in the Christian faith, if they're not connected to this book and connected to Christ, will justify any behavior. There's reasons why I say you have to be in the Word. After that, I want to say this. If you keep reading and probing into this, from the 3rd verse until the 19th verse, that kind of unfolds everything that happens. Specifically, something very clear. There was a certain disciple in the 10th verse at Damascus named Ananias. And to him the Lord said in a vision to Ananias, he said, "Behold, here I am, Lord." The Lord said unto him, "Arise, go into the street which is called Straight, inquire in the house of Judas for one called Saul of Tarsus, for behold, he prayeth. And as seen in a vision, a man named Ananias coming in and putting his hand on him that he might receive his sight." Now, I just want you to think about something. God could have restored Saul's sight without another person, right? God's God, He can do anything. But it's almost as though God chose a devout father who then goes on to say, "Lord, I have heard by many of this man how much evil he hath done to thy saints at Jerusalem. And here he hath authority from the chief priest to bind all that call on thy name. And the Lord said to him, Go thy way, for he is a chosen vessel unto me, to bear my name before the Gentiles and kings and children of Israel. For I will show him how great things he must suffer in my name's sake." Okay, Ananias goes and he does what he's bidden to do, but I want you to focus on something. God being God did not need to use Ananias. But this was all, again, breadcrumbs in Paul's understanding. Paul knew about the prophets of old. He knew how things worked. So here's a man who also, Ananias, is also going to get, we'll call it a cataclysmic change on what God can do, who God can use, who God can call. And this is what I want to begin to kind of push in here. I'm tired of people making out Christianity to be something very lame. Here is a man, you'd say he was a real butt kicker, all right? If you really understand what you're reading, this was no wimp. He did a lot of bad things to the church, and yet God chose him. And this is why it's super important to understand the changes that occur in this man cannot be labeled natural. They cannot be labeled flesh or self-willed. Only God could have taken this, put his hand into the mix and said, I'm going to use this. Here was a man who was so steeped in the Old Testament that once he basically is, we'll call it, given clarity by Christ, he doesn't need to have the whole thing explained to him, because he now, you can see through his writing how he could see how everything in the old pointed to Christ, nothing more. And again, it's this, what I call, on some people's part, the blindness to not see that. So the important thing here, Saul is blind now. He hasn't eaten for 3 days. Ananias comes in, prays for him. He regains his sight, and it says, immediately there fell from his eyes, as it had been like scales, received his sight forthwith, arose, and was baptized. And again, I want you to think about the writing that Paul writes about in Romans when he talks about the baptism. It is the burying of the old man and the rising to walk in newness of life. No one could have understood and written that unless guided by the Spirit of God and having lived in the old understanding. No one could have written it like that to explain it to us with that clarity. So really important. It says he preached Christ in the synagogues, and I have often referred to this experience of Paul's. 3 times it's written in the scriptures, but starting with the light. And so if you comb through Paul's writing, you're going to read a lot of statements like, we were in darkness and translated into the light of his kingdom. So he clearly takes from what he knew from the old, what he experienced with Christ, and he says, this is the way the believer will be transformed. We are all in darkness until he brings us into his glorious light. Paul, not excluded to that. The other blindness that's going to occur, he's going to encounter among his own kindred, which is the blindness where he has such a wealth of knowledge within the scriptures to argue and point out that he had an encounter with Christ, that this indeed is the Messiah. In the blindness of those who were just as well versed as Paul, to not hear and to not receive. There's another check mark of transformation, if you will. It's called, as we get progressive revelation in the scripture, to come to know better and more God's plan and how he unfolded it versus those that say, I cannot see, I refuse to see. So when I say to you, I read that passage where he says, when it pleased God to reveal his Son in me. It was as if he was saying, I actually recognized that God had a plan for me, that I wasn't walking according to that plan, but when it was time, that's what God did. So profoundly clear, it was God who commanded the light to shine and illuminated that darkened heart. And now I'm going to ask you to see a pattern, because the pattern is so abundantly clear and very simple to see. If you go back to creation, God brought the light to separate the light from the darkness. And throughout this entire book, it is basically that, light and darkness. People walking according to God's plan versus walking according to the one who controls the world. And I think there is importance in understanding that is something that goes straight through the Bible. Failure to see that is failure to really grab and comprehend how the depths of the darkness lived in us before we came to know Christ. That makes us reject, refuse, not want to acknowledge, say, I don't need this. But when the time is right, God somehow flips the switch, and somehow people who rejected, who didn't want to know, somehow they want to walk into the light. They don't know why. That's what I'm talking about. There is no flesh that can will it. You cannot make this happen by any other way. And then, of course, I just referred to his baptism. And that baptism is really actually a profound statement that just is a blurb in passing. Because in the process of being baptized, again, I want you to think about what he wrote in Romans regarding that old man. He understood what was happening. It didn't need to be explained to him that somehow later on he writes brilliantly about this need to be basically crucified with Christ, buried with him, to rise, to walk in newness of life, all representational in the act of being baptized. So it's baffling. There's more to this, though. I don't think that we're able to really truly appreciate. See, we all come into the church with ideas, right? Now, maybe we're all not zealously like Paul was, but we all come in. Some of us come in from a Catholic background, some of us from a no background at all, but we all come in with something. And the act of taking the scales off the eyes and getting people to all direct into one place can only be of God. Yes, the preacher must preach and open up the Word of God, but there's an activity of God that has to happen in that person, that transformation that says, I once believed that because that's what I was told to believe, and now that I'm reading, listening, learning, scales have come off my eyes, and I realize, for example, I talk about me, and it's a good way to tell you this. I've said this before. When I came into the church, I was darn sure there was something missing here. You know, there's got to be like an altar call or some act that confirms that I've actually showed up, right? And that I'm actually in. God, help us. Until you find out that that's the trappings of the world putting its ideas onto the church. Those were preachers who wanted to see just how many people were moved in that moment. But being moved in the moment does not equate to a lifetime of faith and walking with the Lord. The only thing that can do that is Christ himself opening the heart, pouring his Spirit into you. That is being born from above, and that transformation begins. It's so fascinating to me that if you really kind of are digging, we read that Saul, who became Paul, we know he spent 3 years somewhere on the backside. It says somewhere Arabia. My personal belief, that is somewhere in the Sinai Peninsula, in the backside of the desert. See, God has a way of repeating himself, and if we're not paying attention, we'll miss it. There were other people that had their instruction and reflection in the desert. Just think of Moses, 40 years on the backside of the desert. You've got people like Elijah who are sorting it out in the desert, in the wilderness. So I want you to think that transformations, so many people, the late Gene Scott was right, so many people want resurrection, but they don't want to go through the process of crucifixion and death. They just want the good stuff. Part of that transformation does require, just as God did with many of these people, to take them in isolation. And for you, it may not be possible to go to the desert. Just saying. But it may be possible for you to have the moments, what I call solace, to think, to pray, to meditate on why certain things are happening. And it's in those internal, quiet moments that God does, I believe, enter in, just like these that were in the desert. And as I said, 3 years that I believe that Christ schooled Paul so that when it was clear, it says, and straightway he preached Christ in the synagogues, that he's the Son of God. That's a big passage that doesn't even take a break to explain how he could go and preach Christ, from being the persecutor of the church to going and preaching Christ. So I believe that that gap of 3 years happened out of chronology of what we read. In any event, completely irrelevant to when it happened, that he was able to not only have understanding from the old and integrate, but he had clarity, so that had God not raised up the Apostle Paul, Christianity would have been a splinter of Judaism, because there was still nobody. If you take Paul's writing out of the book, there was nobody who could explain the law, the curse of the law, that Christ came, although Christ said, I came to fulfill, not to destroy, but only this one explains to us. If you take him out of the book, what do you have? Do you have anybody else talking about and explaining how the law fell on Christ? So I'm telling you, there's a reason why all of these things happen the way they did, that he ends up penning 2/3 of the New Testament to guide us so that we didn't be just a splinter offshoot of Judaism, but we were designed to see, receive, and know the Messiah, Jesus Christ, follow him, and not be going backwards. And this is, I'm going to say something that's going to be controversial, but hey, I do that really good, so what the heck. I can't fathom anybody who's come to know Christ, who calls on the name of Christ, could go backwards into Judaism. I'm just going to leave that there as a hanging chad for you to figure out what the hell I just said. Because for some of you, you might already understand. There's no way, if you have had an encounter with Christ, and I don't mean the light was shining and people were talking, I mean, you know what you know. There's no way that you could slide sideways and say, but I'm going to worship and do this. It's not happening. Paul was cautioning those people, for example, at Galatia, because people came into the church and said, or the synagogue rather, and said, well, you're preaching Christ and we accept all that, but you need these other things from the old way. You need to graft those in. Paul's retort, which I have repeated ad nauseum, is the law was a schoolmaster to bring us to Christ until faith is formed in our heart to Christ, and then that's it. You can take, I've just preached a whole message on the law. But people who don't want to hear will just kind of stay fixated there. So what I'm talking about is a change, an understanding in preaching. So it says he straightway went to preach, but let's analyze something. Think about what, and it's so revolutionary to people, they can't make sense of it. Why did Paul write so profoundly about the faith of Abraham? Because he writes about it in Romans, he writes about it in Galatians. Why? Because he understood something that had to be made clear to him so that he could tell us. Before the law was given, God made a covenant with Abraham, and that covenant was a covenant of faith. And this is why Paul writes in Romans 4 regarding Abraham, he wavered not, he staggered not at the promises of God. The operation was not by works, but by faith. And the whole writing of Paul in the New Testament is hanging on that, not what James says. Sorry, not sorry. So, it's like saying, here, I'll read it to you so you can, somebody asks, oh, it's your opinion. No, it's not my opinion. It's exactly what Paul wrote. He said, brethren, I speak after the manner of men, though it be but a man's covenant, yet if it be confirmed, no man disannuleth or added thereto. Now Abraham and his seed, to him were the promises made. And he said not, and to seeds, as of many, but as of one, to thy seed, which is Christ. You tell me how somebody who is so steeped in the old way could write that and declare it with that great clarity. And that could only have been that God revealed this to him. He sent to the Gentiles. But if you read what I said, Gentiles, kings, and then he says to his own, right? And his own, Paul's own, meaning his brethren, completely, for the most part, rejected everything that he was saying. Now, you have to ask the question, if you're that steeped and you can understand everything about Moses and the law of Moses and all the customs of Moses that all point to Christ, how could you reject Christ? So, as he is, we'll call it, called by God, the changes to me become clearer and clearer. It's not just this, I was here and then I'm there, but even his understanding has been clarified and crystallized. That's what happens to every person. We come into the church and we struggle sometimes at the beginning to understand, because there is no, yes, you can get a guide to reading this, but until God helps your eyes and your understanding, it can be very frustrating. Anybody know what that is? Okay, come in, it's like, I don't understand anything, makes no sense. This is another transformation. We'll call it in points of how God is revealing himself. And as I said, it may not be with this great light as Paul saw, but your understanding, the eyes of your understanding. How many of you have had just in the last maybe year or two where you say, wow, I understand this so much better than I did 10 years ago? How many? That's what I'm talking about. God doesn't just say, okay, I gave it to you once, because we're not able to grasp it one time. So as it's being denned in, it also is taking on dimensions of truth, and those dimensions of truth become something that become more and more solid as time goes on, so that you're not wavering on those, we'll call them the really clear, crystal clear points, but progressive revelation. God's still at work in you. Don't think I have any oration skills. I have zero skills. People say, oh, but you're such a good public speaker. It has nothing to do with public speaking. And to borrow from somebody else's statement, it's not because I have a Ph.D. I got that later, remember? Yeah. That was just 'cause. So God is doing the changing. God helps us. He helps our understanding. The transformation for some people is so radical. I'm going to raise my hand. You know, the kid that came into the church thinking certain things that, you know, you could have just, I would have had a fight with you 25, 30 years ago if you were, you know, these are fighting words. You know, you're telling me that this, and that are not true. Come on, let's go outside, right? That was what was in me. It was like, no way. That's the ignorance that over time God helps us. That's why I said The transformation process is not one singular event. It is ongoing. And that is the wisdom of why when Paul wrote in Romans 12:2, be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed, be ye metamorphosed by the renewing of your mind. I think that there's great wisdom there to say he understood things that we as we go are unfolding and making clear to us that is God's way, still in a transformative period until we don't need any more transformation. We're over there. We're perfected over there, right? So at this point, let's just say Paul now is ministering to the Gentiles. And all that heard him, for the most part, were amazed. If we didn't know the end of the story, you and I might say he had the power to raise up those bones that are spoken of in Ezekiel, the valley of dry bones, that he had the power, possibly with his preaching, to raise those up. Oh no, not so. As I said, they were still wearing a veil, and they still are wearing a veil to this day. So what we encounter a threat so great to this man's life that they have to lower him over the wall of the city in a basket by night. And I'm going to ask you a question. If you knew your life was at stake, and this is not a hypothetical, I'm trying to get you to say, like, really, your life is at stake for what you believe and what comes out of your mouth. If you're a fraud, you're going to shut up. If you're a fraud, you're just going to stay silent, you're going to change your tune, he is secreted away, but he doesn't stop preaching Christ. To me, if somebody said, give me evidence of the verity and the veracity of God's power and God's activity, it's right there, unmistakable. But guess what? We are still looking for the unbelievable, the unfathomable, the miracles that are, oh, I want to see somebody walk on water. And yet when somebody comes into the church, I mentioned to you about someone I've been praying for 20 years, finally coming, what I'd say, to ask questions in the light. And all I can say is, that's God. I've been praying, but God can decide what he wants to do. I've been praying for that person. So now what happens, it's kind of like something that God will keep entering in and keep, we'll say, breadcrumbing the transformations. Because why? We cannot be overwhelmed all at once. And because these transformations, including reading each and every point of Paul's life, give us perspective. So I'm going to ask you this question. If we are in agreement that Paul's not faking it, I mean, what would be his point? Then this is definitely a person who's been touched and changed and being transformed and being transformed. And we could maybe try and say, well, Paul was really working to make this happen. No, he wasn't. Look where he was when God found him. And I'm asking you to consider maybe where you were when God found you, because we have this amazing ability to whitewash where we've been and how we've been and where we were before we encountered Christ. I'm asking you to think about that, to say, you are no different. I am no different. May not be that, I didn't end up on the ground. Well, maybe I did eventually, but I didn't end up on the ground straightways, right? I was still kind of haughty and thinking, oh, this is easy peasy, right? Until God comes along and says, okay, I'm going to show you what that's like. And you begin to get buffered. And that's another chapter in Paul's life that he even speaks about. When he writes the Galatians and he says the infirmity in his flesh, which we don't know, and I don't think it was ophthalmia, or whether we talk about the fact that he suffered and was buffered by the devil. And I believe that his conscience was constantly plagued by what he did when he did not yet know the Lord. I believe that with all my heart. And that's very easy for someone to come into the kingdom, walk in the light, and still feel a sense of guilt for where they were, what they were doing, or how they behaved. And that's part of the transformation, is understanding that God gives you that grace. You receive it as a gift. And he says it's sufficient. Walk in it. Just like the light, just like his love, just like his saving grace. Walk in it. Okay. Now the Spirit begins this process. And as I said, it's that struggle, but still part of the transformation. Paul is now clear about his mission. He sets off to go and meet Peter. I think it's not written, but I'm just going to make something up that I believe probably happened and we'll never know until we get over there. I'm pretty sure that when Paul met up with Peter, they probably sat down and said, let's share stories. What exactly happened to you? What did you see, right? I'm sure, it's not recorded for us, but I'm pretty sure that that had to be part of their conversation. You cannot have both Peter and what he witnessed and Paul and what he went through and not have these exchanges. We don't read that, but I believe it occurred. And then we have something interesting where Paul later writes and says, I'm not behind any of these people. Now, he calls himself chiefest of sinners, but he says, I'm not behind in any of these that call themselves apostles, because he came to, again, in the transformation that God was doing to show him, God brought him to the kingdom in many ways. I'm going to say it, and it's controversial what I'm going to say, but basically to rescue the church from becoming the Jamesian influence that it would have been had he not raised up a Paul. And the dangers of that, you can see all around you today in the news. People are blurring the lines. They can't see, and we have these references that people want to toss around. I've even erroneously said it in times past, saying Judeo-Christian, but actually, if you're really careful about what you're reading, yes, many of the things that we are reading are rooted in the Old Testament, but they don't necessarily make them Judeo. I want you to just think about that. They make them God's old covenant, not necessarily Judeo. Just pause on that. Don't get hung up, but if you want to think about it later, I'm sure you'll have lots of thoughts. All right, so in Acts 14:27, they gathered the church together to recount how God had opened the door of faith unto the Gentiles. And now we are crystal clear seeing the assignment that was given to Paul to go to preach to the Gentiles, unfolding before our eyes in this telling of his life, if you will. So I'm going to ask you a question which doesn't really require answers immediately. It requires thought. And don't be so fast to answer yes or no. Think about the changes God may have already made in your life or your trajectory, whether it's your goals, your work, whatever that is, choosing a mate, that God steered or guided you to certain places. When you can really start to see that, I mean, I've said this for a long time, that God guided me here. I could have landed in a church that has batting eyelashes. Not really, but you understand what I'm saying. God ensured that I landed here. And there was a reason, because if you look at the history, this is not a church with a history of being wimpish or cowardly. It's the church that truly represents what I call biblical courage and faith. That represents all of you who are here, because if you're here, you have the chutzpah to say, yeah, I'm here, and there's a reason why I'm here. Because you could have landed anywhere else, so could I. So I'm just asking you to take a little second to think about that. And we all know Paul's mind was changed, his heart was changed, his ways, even the way he refers to himself when he's writing. Again, we cannot understand a lot of the delicacies of when he wrote a lot of his letters, and he says, Paulos doulos, Paul, a slave of Christ Jesus. And I really want you to take a second to think about that. Here is a high-strung, you will not put me in my box, don't tell me what to do, now calling himself a slave of Christ. As a Roman citizen, that would have sent shockwaves to people reading that, knowing he was a Roman citizen and a Jew, now following Christ, using those words. That is staggering. Again, we don't have all we can do. Some people react to the word servant or slave in the most pejorative way, and they link their minds to slavery in recent history, not understanding what that would have meant for Gentiles, specifically those, for example, of Roman descent. A whole different meaning. That would have meant, for a Roman listening to that verbiage, would have meant you were either a criminal or some scum or some derelict of society to end up, because Romans, we tend to say Romans couldn't be slaves. Yes, they could be. But to use that verbiage in that day and age when people would have connected it to something else. It's like, whoa. So he transfers that meaning onto the Lord. You have to stop and think, not just was he changed in mission, in mindset, but even in his verbiage. You're not going to tell me that a man who was of his former faith would have even used those words, because servant and the connotations of servant or slave in the Old Testament, well, they had a different meaning. So just, if you can understand when I'm saying the reality of the child of God says, thanks be to God that he leads me in triumph, that he came to save me, that he redeemed me, and I belong to him. I'm not my own anymore, just like Paul wrote, I'm not my own anymore, I belong to him, bought and paid for through the blood of Christ. That is a changed person that says that. A person still walking what I call lip service to God will not say, the Lord bought me with his blood. They can't bring themselves to utter that. It's too impossible for them. And when I say to you, there are also two types of people in the church. Yes, there are those who will say, I'm bought and paid for, he owns me, I am his, I want to be with him in eternity, I belong to him, versus those people that say, well, I'm a Christian, but that still goes on. Imagine the concept when we talk about this. You know, we talk about families looking and resembling. You find the mother and father and the children, you say, oh, I can see the family resemblance there. Sometimes it's resemblance or mannerisms. When you come into God's family, there is the transformation that begins to transform you as a child of God. And that transformation, lifelong, begins to take you from where you started to the you're supposed to be in Christ, so that Christ is more easily seen. Now, this is not the license to go out, and you've heard me use the analogy of hanging plastic fruit on the tree to say, look, fruit, right? But it is the requirement to understand what it means. The Spirit is helping you, conforming you, guiding you, leading you. And even to those people who I call them lazy, they don't want to open up the Bible. Oh, I can't stand reading the Bible. It's too difficult. Change occurs little by little to where one day all of a sudden you find yourself with about 5 books on your kitchen table and dictionaries, and suddenly you're like, what happened to me, right? That's the experience of most people. You don't start off like that. But if you really get interested, you're going to get into some deep, deep, deep rabbit holes. And finally, you kind of say, it's because God is still working to transform my mind. Remember the word metanoia, the change of the mind, right? And that is what he's working on. So what I like about this, Paul's message becomes clearer and clearer. So that when you get into 2 Corinthians, he starts off by saying, I knew a man in Christ about 14 years ago. He's referring to himself. And if you do the math, that probably takes you back somewhere between Acts 9 and Acts 15, somewhere in that window, what he's describing, where it says he was taken up and he saw things that he can't repeat. I'm telling you something. Most of us will never experience that, okay? In fact, I'm going to say 99.9 of us will not. Anybody that says they've had that experience, you might want to move to the other side of the room, okay? God did something specifically for this man. And if you are understanding why I keep going down this trail of saying transformation, because now he's turning around, he's saying, not only did he spend time 3 years in the desert with the Lord in Arabia or the Sinai Peninsula, but he had a vision. He says he was transported, and he's saying, I saw things I can't repeat. Now, this is not a man who doesn't have substance underneath him. Everything that he's written has substance. So when he says he was transported and saw a vision, I actually believe him. There's other people, if they say that, I'm like, okay, I'm checked out. But I believe what he's saying. So he received some revelation, some things that he couldn't repeat. And that equally is part of his transformation, because as he received this, simultaneously, I believe the devil began to buffet him to keep him humble. Otherwise, I believe his feet would have floated off the ground, because he's had this experience. He's been called. Everything is honky-dory. So he's encountering all these problems, including the fact that he's being incredibly led by God, because it says one door was open, then they were hindered to go to Asia, then another door was open for him. It's like This is the mind of the child of God that can understand. Transformation may not happen all at once, but in a progressive way, God will open and close doors for you your entire life. As long as you are looking at the door, that's what he does. Doors of opportunity, doors of faith, things that he desires no more. Remember when Paul says, when I was a child, I thought as a child, right? Some doors that close, that he deliberately closes, knowing it's for your benefit without you even really recognizing he's closed them. How many know in your life the doors that he's closed? Okay? And that's what I'm talking about. When you come to see that, it's like saying, not only do I trust God, not only do I know what he's done, but this is the manner, when we talk about, we can make it into the wonderful image of the potter, the clay on the wheel, but this is the real clay being worked out and unfolded and written and chronicled and documented for us to say, there is no person that can come in contact with Christ that will not be changed, for better or for worse. And I think the thing that I'm probably as a pastor wrestling with is that there are a lot of people, I've spoken on this before, who I believe have arrested development. They've not progressed. They're not any further along. I'm not specifically talking about anybody in my eyesight or in the sound of my voice, so don't think that I'm saying that about anybody. I do believe that there are people that suffer from this. They get to a point of complacency. They do not believe that God is still working in their life, leading them, guiding them, an ongoing transformation, week by week. Now, let me tell you how thoroughly convinced I am of this. And this is a hard one for me to pack into the 5 minutes that are left of my time, but I'll say it like this. If it weren't for the Lord leading me to take a deeper dive into this book, I may still be stuck, arrested development, in ideas that may have been propagated in my life that I once held to that are not necessarily biblical. Do you understand what I just said? That's God saying, no, keep digging. You haven't mined the depth, and you haven't yet understood. I'm not insulted. I actually think, wow, how gracious that God would keep giving me revelation, that it's not somewhere, I've reached the pinnacle of understanding and I've arrived. No, no, no. If you think that, that's when your mind dies. But rather, that this transformation might say, well, Pastor, I don't feel like God's done anything like that in my life. And I want you to stop, take a second, more than a second, maybe an hour or two, to sit and quietly reflect, because I believe every person can look back and say, oh no, the Lord was leading me. How many people here moved to California 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, for a reason not quite known to you, but you ended up here? How many people drifted into this church by curiosity, not knowing what they were going to hear? Okay. I could keep going because there's so many of these, and it all ties in neatly to how God uniquely operates with each and every one of us. So my experience is not going to be your experience. Not only did God bring me halfway around the world, but then he brought me across the country, and I ended up here. Like, here. Ta-da! Right? So what I'm trying to say is, when I look back, I think, oh, no, no. No accidents here. The doors that the Lord opened and the doors that the Lord closed are all part of that transformation. So what am I urging you to leave here with? When you look at the life of Paul, I want you to see that he represents what God does. And God may not be doing it to that degree, but he represents what God does. He takes what former baggage you may have had, some of it being good and being applied, some of it being not so good and being disregarded as revelation occurs, changing the mind, changing the way you view yourself, changing the way you see others. And the reason why this is so important in this day and age for this hour is you've got a lot of people parading, talking about the Christian faith, talking about what Christianity means, but at the end of the day, it's nothing different than everything else out there, just something that you something good, something okay, versus something that's so transformative that you could never look at it any other way than just that. The metamorphosis that God, just for me in my life, that God's done, and it's ongoing. I'm nowhere near Paul, probably couldn't even be the dirt under his small fingernail, but I understand what God does and how it works is this. As I said, some people will come through the door and say, oh, I want to feel good. You're not making me feel good. Let me feel good. Let me go find someone that can just make me feel great. But they're not being transformed. Versus the people, if you want it in real analogies, the people that go to get petted versus the people that get that really angry, deep tissue massage where you walk out and you feel like somebody's hit you, right? It's kind of what God is doing. He's not massaging you, though. He's going deep so that you don't stay on the surface. And every part of your body is what the letter of Hebrews says, dividing asunder, right? Between bone and flesh or marrow, piercing deep enough to penetrate that person's being so that you don't go there and say, I'm not sure about this. You are either certain of God's hand in your life, and these may be so subtle to you because maybe the eyes are still dim, but I ask you to take a second look, because once that becomes clear and you realize the transformation is still ongoing, you're going to say, God's not finished with me yet. He still has work to do, and I am yielding myself, as Paul wrote in Romans 6, to become a tool of righteousness in his hands. That is probably what I'd call next level transformation, to realize he actually has a plan for me, and he's got a plan for you. It's not planned for Pastor Scott. It's a plan for your life individually and uniquely that is attached to this transformation. Yielding to it provides the fruit that he alone enjoys. Moving away from it, well, that's to your own peril. Kind of tying into last week's message out of 1 Corinthians. All I'm going to tell you is, for all those people out there that are confused, hang on. If you're waiting for something immense to happen, don't. Because it is something imperceptible and over time. The only people that are going to really truly know in the immediate now that change has occurred are the people that you haven't seen in 10 or 15 years that might say, what happened to you? And that you're kind of a different person. You won't notice it, but walking long enough with the Lord, you're going to turn around, you're going to see those things, and it becomes part of that, what I call awe factor, that God really did enter in. And this is not all just some exercise and wishful thinking and the clicking of the heels 3 times to get to some other place, but rather what he says and what he has said, he makes good on. So if you're one of those people that, but I don't feel it yet, you're not to feel it. You're to inspect, take a spiritual inventory, and keep pressing in. God will do the rest, not by you to will, but by receiving the free gift that he gives of his salvation. He begins to do that work, which I guarantee you may be towards the end of your road, and when you look back, it will be unmistakable that his hand was upon you, and he never took it off of you in the first place. That's my message. You've been watching me, Pastor Melissa Scott, live from Glendale, California at Faith Center. If you would like to attend the service with us Sunday morning at 11 a.m., simply call 1-800-338-3030 to receive your pass. If you'd like more teaching and you'd like to go straight to our website, the address is www.pastormelissascott.com.